You got the raise. Not a small one. A real one. The kind you had been angling toward for long enough that when it came through, you did the math in your head immediately. You figured out what it meant per month. You thought about what you would do differently. For a moment, it felt like something had shifted, like the number that had been creating pressure had finally moved. That feeling lasted for a while, a few weeks maybe, long enough to feel real. And then it didn't feel like anything in particular. Not because something went wrong, not because you made a bad decision with the money or failed to use it wisely. The raise was there, the number in your account was larger, and yet the quality of your daily experience was approximately what it had been before. The same low-level financial awareness, the same sense that you were managing but not quite ahead, the same occasional feeling that more would help if you could get it. This is not a personal failure. It is not a sign that you are bad with money or constitutionally incapable of satisfaction. What happened to you has a name, and it has been studied carefully enough that researchers can predict it in advance with reasonable accuracy. It is called hedonic adaptation, and it is one of the most consequential and least acknowledged forces operating on the relationship between income and the actual feeling of financial well-being. The foundational research on hedonic adaptation comes from Philip Brickman, a psychologist whose work in the late 1970s remains among the most cited and most unsettling findings in the psychology of happiness. In a study that has become almost impossible to discuss without producing a long pause, Brickman and his colleagues compared three groups: people who had recently won major lottery prizes, people who had recently become paraplegic due to accidents, and a control group whose lives had not been disrupted by any major event. The expectation would be that lottery winners report significantly higher happiness than the control group, and that the accident victims report significantly lower happiness. The expectation is only partially correct. What Brickman found was that within approximately a year of their life-changing events, both groups had returned to roughly the same baseline happiness level as the control group. The lottery winners were not dramatically happier. The accident victims were not dramatically less happy. Both had adapted. This finding is not about resilience exactly, though resilience is part of it. It is about something more structural. Brickman and his colleague Donald Campbell identified what they called the hedonic treadmill, the tendency of human happiness to return to a relatively stable baseline regardless of what happens to external circumstances. The treadmill is always moving. You can run faster on it, but you do not get further from where you started. The mechanism is not mysterious once you understand it. Human perception is fundamentally comparative, not absolute. You do not experience temperature as a fixed measurement. You experience it relative to what you were just exposed to. You do not experience loudness as a decibel reading. You experience it relative to the ambient noise you adapted to. The same principle applies to income. The raise that felt significant was significant relative to your prior income. Once your spending, your expectations, and your sense of what is normal all adjusted upward to match the new number became the baseline. And a baseline, by definition, does not feel like anything special. It feels like the floor. This upward adjustment in expectations has a behavioral expression that is so consistent it has its own informal name: lifestyle inflation. The apartment that was fine before the raise becomes inadequate shortly after. The restaurant tier that felt like a treat becomes the new regular. The car, the vacation standard, the version of things you consider acceptable. Each of these reference points shifts upward with income, usually gradually enough that no individual shift feels dramatic. Together, they consume the raise before it has an opportunity to produce anything other than new expectations. This is not weakness. It is the rational response of a system that is designed to notice changes, not levels. The same adaptation that prevents you from being permanently ecstatic about your house prevents you from being permanently devastated by a bad commute. It is the same feature, operating on both sides. The price is that it also prevents you from being permanently better off in any felt sense because of a raise. Sonia Lyubomirsky, a psychologist whose work on happiness has become a standard reference in the field, has spent years trying to understand what actually determines how happy people are over time. Her research, which synthesizes a large body of findings across behavioral economics and psychology, arrives at a finding that is difficult to absorb the first time you hear it. Approximately 50% of the variation in happiness across people is accounted for by genetic baseline, the set point you were born with, the temperamental tendency toward positive or negative effect that exists independent of what happens to you. Circumstances, which include income, where you live, whether you are employed, your relationship status, account for approximately 10%. The remaining 40% is accounted for by intentional activities, what you do, how you engage with your life, the habits and practices you maintain. The raise is a circumstance. Circumstances account for 10%. And because of adaptation, even that 10% shrinks over time as the new circumstance becomes the baseline. This does not mean money is unimportant. The research on income and well-being is consistent on this point. Below certain income thresholds, money matters enormously. When income is insufficient to meet basic needs, housing, food, healthcare, security, increases in income produce significant and durable improvements in well-being. The floor matters. Getting off the floor matters. But past the point where needs are met, the relationship between more income and more happiness becomes complicated. Not because the money stops being useful, but because the adaptation that blunts its emotional effect does not turn off. Every increment of additional income produces less felt impact than the increment before it, because the reference point has already moved upward to absorb the previous one. What this means in practice is that the strategy of earning more in order to feel better about money is not a strategy that terminates. There is no income level at which the adaptation stops and the satisfaction becomes permanent. The treadmill does not have an off switch built into the earning side. Richard Easterlin, an economist who has spent decades studying the relationship between income growth and happiness at the national level, found a pattern that mirrors the individual level research. As countries grow wealthier over time, average happiness levels do not rise in proportion to average income. Across a wide range of countries and time periods, rising GDP does not produce rising happiness. Nations get richer. Their citizens do not report proportionally better lives. The treadmill operates at the societal level the same way it operates at the individual level. The new normal absorbs the new wealth. Morgan Housel, whose work on the psychology of money has appeared throughout this series, makes an observation that goes directly to the practical implication of all of this. He argues that the goal of wanting more is not inherently a problem. Wanting more is part of how people improve their situations. The problem, he says, is that wanting more is a goalpost that moves automatically and invisibly with every improvement in your actual situation. You are always running toward a target that is always moving, just far enough ahead to stay out of reach. Though, the practical reflection here is not that raises are meaningless or that earning more is a futile exercise. It is something more foundational than that. It is that the feeling of having enough is not a function of how much you have. It is a function of the relationship between what you have and what you have adapted to expecting. And that relationship is something you can influence, not by suppressing the adaptation entirely, because the adaptation is not voluntary, but by becoming aware of the rate at which your expectations are moving and choosing, at least occasionally, not to let them run quite as fast as they otherwise would. The raise is real. The money is real. What is not automatically real, and what does not arrive with the raise itself, is the lasting sense that things are now better than they were. You got the raise. The question is what you thought would change.